Thank you for coming today. I'm delighted to be here with you, and I appreciate you coming to our offices today. I do want to point you to one piece of art that we have here. We typically don't collect art, but we do have a Sam Gilliam piece right out in the foyer that you were in. Those of you who have been to the Kennedy Center have seen Sam's work before, and I thought you might want to see that before you leave today, so I appreciate your coming out. I'm delighted to be joined today by Patrick Kennedy. Phil, you did a great job introducing him. 8-term congressman from the state of Rhode Island. In 2013, founded the Kennedy Forum, and we're going to go through a discussion today on mental health crisis in America and what business can do, and it's time for business to move. So Patrick, thanks for being here. Welcome back to Washington.
Thanks, Tim.
What's it feel like to be back here after 10 years away now?
Well, it's good to see my former colleagues here. Bart from Tennessee, Bart Gordon and I served together, and appreciate him being here. Was a great supporter of mine personally throughout my time in Congress. And Tom McMillan, who I didn't have a chance to serve with, but served with many other family members of mine. But I got to see him a lot when I was on the Hill, and thanks, Tom, for coming. It's a kind of deja vu being back. Or else it's called post-traumatic stress, whatever you want to remember. One of the privileges we have is we can go to the floor of the House. And whenever I go to the floor of the House, seeing some of my old colleagues, I can't ever talk to them, so they're so busy tweeting messages back to their constituents, which I think to myself, thank God we didn't have social media back when I was in the Congress. I wouldn't have to spend all my days trying to figure out how to message my supporters and donors as to what I was doing. So,
well, I suspect there are a few people that may not know your story, Patrick, and I know Washington has long memory, but also has short memory as well. So, Patrick, what is it about your background that makes you the leading advocate today in mental health advocacy?
Well, first I say to people, you got me by default, because I was actually in my race for my second term in the state legislature in Rhode Island. And I woke up one morning and my chief of staff said to me, "You're not going to like this." And he said, "You're on the cover of the National Enquirer." And he said, "The guy that you went to drug rehab with at 17 up in New Hampshire, he kept a diary of being your roommate, and he sold it to the National Enquirer for $10,000. And his picture is on the cover of National Enquirer along with yours. And it's the headline, Patrick Kennedy, drug addict, diary of his roommate in rehab." So I obviously thought, because this was back in 91, being called a drug addict in 91 was not what it is today. Like, you could survive it today. Back then, a totally different attitude. But I represented a very Italian-American community in Providence, Rhode Island. And I went to the guy that helped me get elected, named Frank DiPaolo Jr. And I say Frank DiPaolo Jr. because he was my treasurer, even though he had less than a high school education and didn't know numbers, because under the law, you're supposed to put your treasurer's name on all of your literature. So I chose Frank as my treasurer because it was my subliminal way of making sure everyone in my Italian-American neighborhood knew that Frank was with Patrick. And I was running against an Irish guy named Skeffington, who was a funeral home director. And his slogan of the campaign was that he was the last guy to let you down. And Frank helped me get the Italian-American vote, because as Skeffington and I split the Irish. So I went over to Frank's house, and he had seen this National Enquirer, because of course, these things are on every checkout counter of every five and dime, every supermarket. And he wouldn't look around at me when I came in. And then he started muttering, "That rat." And I was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Frank. I know I let you down. I feel so ashamed of myself." He goes, "That rat." And then he turned around and goes, "That rat bastard." And I was like taken back. And then he said, "Buddy, you want me to do something about this? I swear to God, this actually happened. And at that moment, I grew up here in Virginia, McLean, Virginia, and I didn't know all this nomenclature about rat and all this stuff, so I was like still trying to put it together. But I knew enough that he was basically indicating that he's about to go and search this guy out and do harm to him physically. So I said, no, thank you, Frank. It means a lot to me, though, that you. But so anyway, my next campaign was "We're with Pat, not the rat." So I won my next election overwhelmingly in my district, and then when I was running for Congress, same thing. Someone said, "Patrick Kennedy, tell us your drug dealers." And of course, I thought my campaign was going to not survive, and I ended up winning for Congress. So by the time I got to Congress, I didn't have this worry that I had to keep everything a secret, right? Which is why I was the youngest member from the smallest state in the country and in the minority party, because Newt Gingrich had just taken over as Speaker, and yet I got to put my name number one on the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act. And that should tell you everything about stigma, because usually, as Bart and Tom and I know, usually the chairman and the senior leadership get to be the ones to put their name first on bills. And it showed how popular it was to have your name next to the words mental and addiction, because those two words were in the title of the bill, the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act. So again, I got there by default because no one was racing me to the bill to be the sponsor. And I had the freedom to do it because this guy ended up being the best thing that ever happened to me when he outed me. So that's how.
So we got you by default, but you chose purposefully to be transparent about everything. And your book, by the way, is fantastic. And your co-author, Stephen Freed, does a masterful job with you in here. If you haven't read A Common Struggle, I strongly recommend it. It's gripping, and yet you promised to have the most transparent recovery in the history of recoveries. And so that positions you well for doing this. I just wanted to say thank you for doing that.
Thank you, Tim. I really appreciate my cousin Mark Schreiber connecting us, and really grateful that you've convened so many of your colleagues here on this issue. And I have never found a moment more significant for this cause, and never anticipated that I would be in this juncture in life where I could take my experience serving as a lawmaker and actually help understand where our advocacy needs to be going, because it's not so much the specific issues that we need to take on to change the current status quo. It's more the process that we need to take on in order to get the results that we all want.
But why now? I mean, we've got debt ceiling, we've got gun control, we have reproductive rights, we have a lot of really big ticket items right now. Why mental health now?
Well, as everyone who's in this room knows, that they're the ones who are the true fiduciaries of this problem, because I know we have a payer represented here, but they know too that they work for all the self-insured plans out there. They're the ones who get contracted to manage the benefits. But if the employer groups themselves do not step up and say, this is a priority, I don't want just the numbers on how mental health reduces my total medical spend. I want the numbers on how it impacts the churn that I see every year in my employees, soft retiring or deciding not to come back to work or what have you. These are really mental health issues. And let alone, how do you measure productivity of not just the employees, but just how that impacts the productivity in the bottom line for big companies. I think this is such a big issue for employers who, frankly, I think are going to be our best allies right now in changing the way we do mental health in this country, because I know the word existential has been overused, but it really is true. When you look at all the challenges that our young people are going through today, they're all going to be your future employees, right? And you already are experiencing it with your current workforce. So just imagine what it's going to be like going forward. So what I'm saying is, I know there's a lot. We certainly know we're existential crisis in our democracy, with the mass shootings every other day, with the, challenges abroad in Russia and China and Iran and other places. I mean, there's no shortage of major issues. But if we can't respond to those challenges in a healthy way, and we as a people are constantly in a reactive mode, meaning our amygdalas are making our decisions for us, which I would venture to say is what's happening to our body politic today. Politicians are playing to the fear response. When people are stressed, they don't have enough sleep, they don't have enough time in their day, they're not reacting through their prefrontal cortex and making reasonable decisions. And it all seems overwhelming, so they become very vulnerable to demagogues. I mean, I don't think I'm oversimplifying where we are as a nation. So when Bart and I were doing the Homeland Security bill, but this is when we first created the department, we were trying to get more mental health embedded in that. And people were like, well, why would you do that? And we thought, well, because terror is a psychological weapon. When they blow up the buildings or do something, they're not blowing up their buildings. They're trying to create havoc in our markets. They're trying to create a response, whether it be adaptive or maladaptive, that destroys our cohesion and sets our economy on fire. So shouldn't we be creating, like we did back in the Cold War, kind of a civil preparedness system? And I think now when you're seeing all these active shooter situations, which tragically are becoming so commonplace, employers are going to have to think about, well, how do we respond to these situations in our own businesses? This might be an opportunity to really help build skill sets for every employee to learn how to self-modulate, learn how their brain works, learn the kinds of things we all wish we had been taught by our education system, because frankly, all the numeracy and literacy and history in the world is great, but if you can't self-manage your default mode of thinking, like your counterproductive thinking patterns. I don't know if anybody has those in their lives, but if you're like me and now have to get up 5 times a night to go to the bathroom and you're gripped by fear, unexplicable fear, and intrusive thoughts in your head which keep you from getting back to sleep, like knowing how you make decisions in the world and why you make the decisions you do is really critical to your own agency, meaning you're not stuck on the rat trap in life where you're on the hamster wheel and you don't realize that you just ran through life and you had no insight to how you actually were present in life and lived life. So that's a long way of saying mental health is not just to try to solve the very challenging problems of suicide and overdose and addiction and mental illness. It's about the whole spectrum, which is a new phenomenon. Post-COVID, it was always about people with addiction or people with suicide ideation. Today, it's about everybody, because we're recognizing this is not just someone who has become sick, but is how do we all stay healthy? And that, I think, is the big challenge.
So I want to come back to the policy side, but I want to go to a report. This is at the business economics level. A report out of the New England Journal of Medicine referenced in your book on page 227, and in which this article suggests that at least in a study of 7 federal government agencies, that healthcare costs actually declined the more that we cared about mental health. Now, that came as a shock to me when I went. So they either stayed the same or declined, and I think in our conversations earlier, as you mentioned, that doesn't even take into account all of the benefits of it. So is that study, has that been extended? Has it?
So it's well validated in the literature that mental health is really, if carved into total medical expenses, which is often hasn't been the case historically. Mental health has been carved out and separately contracted to these other kind of managed care organizations just on the mental illness side. Problem with that is you look at it as a cost in a vacuum. You don't see how if you address that with the resources necessary, which no one wants to spend because it's substantial, right? But if you compare it to what the person's total spend is on the rest of their physical health spend, you see that it's more economical to address the mental health, because if you want adherence, which is if 80% of the health spend at Medicare and Medicaid is all chronic illnesses, all those chronic illnesses are going to be, umpteen times higher if you have underlying, depression, anxiety, and the like, let alone addiction, which is prevalent in America, whether people want to recognize it or not. So if adherence is the holy grail to cardiovascular disease, to diabetes, to all of these things, and yet we don't have a medical corps that is remotely literate in mental health, because medical schools never taught people about mental health. It was always kind of almost an extracurricular for medical residents. So all I'm saying is we're dealing with a legacy of discrimination towards this whole issue. We've not only just not paid for it, which is the reason we're now in such a crisis in terms of workforce, because no one ever bothered to go into it, because no one got reimbursed for it. When you calculate how do doctors get paid, it's under relative value units, RVUs. The American Medical Association has never fought for increasing RVUs for mental health because it would mean a political trade-off with the hospitalists and the surgeons, who are the ones that are more established. So politically, the APA is not really high on the food chain in the House of Medicine. Now Patrick Conway used to be at CMS. I went over to him and was lobbying him on collaborative care codes. And he said, Patrick, I've got a conga line out the front at CMS of oncologists and cardiovasculars and surgeons. No one comes to see me on mental health. And do you realize we have never done one demonstration project on the impact of mental health on healthcare? One of the real reasons I'm proud that Governor Leavitt, former HHS secretary under Bush, and I have partnered through the Leavitt Partners to try to get the Business Roundtable to get more engaged in this, because like everything else in this town, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And if the Chamber of Commerce, if business community says this is important to us, believe me, we move mental health up to the front of the line. And that's going to be true with the way you advocate on behalf of your employees when it comes to which insurance company you're going to have manage your third-party administrator. So anyway, that I'll try to stop.
No, so I could go two different ways here. I think the segue, I think, is to October of this year is the 60th anniversary of the Community Mental Health Act of 1963, which President Kennedy signed into law.
Yes.
And it's the 15th anniversary of the Mental Health Parity and
Addiction Equity Act.
Yeah. Which, by the way, is a fascinating treatment in this book. I learned so much about the legislative process through that. I probably should have known it, but it's very complicated how you even define what mental health is, right? And so in October of this year, your forum, the Kennedy Forum, is standing behind an initiative up at the JFK Library in Boston. Would you like to, let's go in that direction, then we'll come back to some of the other business. Sure. But I think this is a great opportunity for business to speak up.
Sure. So, well, as I mentioned earlier, I was elected at 21 to the state legislature, and then I was elected at 27 to the Congress, and 31 in Democratic leadership. And I know none of it had to do with my last name being Kennedy whatsoever. It was all my good looks and personality, Bart, that got me so far. So I know this Kennedy thing can work, right? So when I leave Congress, I no longer have a title, I don't have an office, but I've got the keys to the John F. Kennedy Library. So on the anniversary of JFK's moonshot speech, I talked to Caroline. She said, you can have it, the library. And so I brought all the neuroscientists who run the NIH, head of National Institute of Neurological Disorders, alcoholism, depression, addiction. There's literally over half a dozen institutes that study the brain that, as we know, don't always share an agenda of collaborative research when it could be helpful to all of them. Anyway, so I brought them all to the library for the anniversary of the moonshot, and but they all want to come, right? Because I got, Buzz Aldrin coming, and I got these other celebs, and they're like, we loved, the moonshot. Many of them were like just kids when it started. And when I got there, I said to them, you're our astronauts of today, because you guys are the ones that are going to take us to the race to inner space, not outer space. And the technology we created to do the supercomputer for us to do space travel is actually the computing technology that now allows us to really understand the most complex organ of the body, which takes so much data capacity in order to untangle how do we make sense of this complex organ that we've never been able to truly understand. So they all sign on, and I thought, this went so well, I'm going to find another JFK anniversary to convene people. So I found the Community Mental Health Act, which was the last bill President Kennedy signed in October of '63. And of course, earlier that year, he did the civil rights speech. And that civil rights speech could be applied to people with these illnesses, because he said, who amongst us would trade the color of their skin and be content with those who counsel patience and delay? You could say that for people with addiction and mental illness today. Like, who amongst us would counsel patience and delay when it's your child that's suffering from addiction and mental and has to wait 6 months to get an appointment, or cannot get access to inpatient treatment when they desperately need it, or get admitted but then are kicked out after 5 days? Like, who amongst us would be tolerating this if this were you? So that was what JFK was basically saying in the civil rights, and I just kind of appropriated that civil rights mantra to this issue, because parity is really kind of a medical version, because it basically says you can no longer treat the brain as separate and unequal from the rest of the body. You can't have higher premiums, co-pays, deductibles, lower lifetime caps in insurance coverage. That's what the parity law said. But we dug in real deep. Inpatient in-network, outpatient in-network, inpatient out-of-network, outpatient out-of-network, pharmacy, ER. We require mental health and addiction to be treated the same, primary, secondary, tertiary levels of care, as all other physical conditions. Now, one of the things that we're working in with Governor Leavitt is that we need to bring greater transparency and understanding about what those rules look like, and make sure we modernize them with time, because, as you know, value-based contracting presents us the best opportunity to really improve mental health, because now with the value-based world, we'll pay for the things that we've never paid for in healthcare, which is supportive housing, the Fountain House model, for those of you familiar with Fountain House, the Clubhouse model. These are community resources that we just don't pay for, but have a much bigger bang for our buck in the mental health addiction space. Like, I'm obviously in recovery. I help a lot of my fellows in recovery, many of them who go to these sober houses, which are, by the way, some of them are terrific. And, I know you all are interested in that. But some of them aren't so great, and it really perpetuates the problem. So long and short of it is, we're going to use this event in October to both highlight parity and where we've made progress, but where we still have yet to go. And then the notion of community is where we're really after, because this isn't just a medical issue, right? Although the money comes from the medical insurance, it's a social issue. It's an economic. Everybody has to be part of it. That's the great thing about JFK's Community Mental Health Act. It gives us a narrative today that says this isn't just the psychiatrist problem, which a lot of people just say, oh, if we could just get better pharmaceuticals and we could just get more psychiatrists, we'll be all right. No. We need housing. We need to transform our education system to teach kids, life skill development, coping mechanism, problem-solving skills. we need to do a lot of things. We need to reform our criminal justice system so that we're not arresting everybody with a mental illness or addiction. But before we even do that, we need to build capacity to treat people, or else they're going to end up in the criminal justice system. We need to map all of this out. And it sounds like a very big endeavor. But it isn't. If you think about this town, we have, brain trusts all over this town that are well funded to churn out white papers on big important issues. Except there's no brain trust in this town churning out white papers to help inform better policy making on this issue. So what we're going to do at this event, we're going to produce the first ever, it's hard for me to even believe when I say this, guide for members of Congress by each committee in Congress to show them and delineate all the issues that will improve the system as a whole by each committee in Congress.
So the analogy you used earlier about all the doctors lined up at the door waiting to get help, the same now for mental health. That's the point, is to bring together everybody so there's a one-stop shop for knowing what needs to be done.
For all of our colleagues who are too busy to think about everything, who want to be helpful on this cause, because it's important back home, but don't know what they can do to help, we want to make it easy for them. We want to literally give them the answers to the test and just map out. So I went on the Armed Services Committee because I represented Rhode Island. We have the Navy there. And I'll never forget my friends, the environmentalists who helped get me elected, came in. And I'm like, sorry, guys, it's Army, Air Force, Marines. I got the Navy down here. Sorry, I can't help you. They said, what are you talking about, Patrick? Do you know the Department of Defense has a bigger environmental budget than the whole Environmental Protection Agency? And I said, I had no idea. Because I didn't. I didn't know that the government, DOD, is the biggest funder of Superfund cleanup sites in the world, because all the Navy bases and Army bases are all toxic, right? So anyway, my point is, and then I had the labor guys coming. I'm sorry, guys, this is Department of Defense. Can't help you. No, oh, wait a second. We got major prevailing wage issues here up in the base you can help us with. I'm like, oh, really? Didn't know. The labor guys knew it. The environmentalists knew it. So what's the problem with the mental health and addiction world? They're not going up there and telling members of Congress, you're on the State Department committee? What the hell does that have to do with mental health and addiction? Well, if you do better enforcement of tracking of precursors, which are the source of the new synthetic drugs that are pouring into our country, you're not doing your job if you care about this issue, because we've got to have both treatment, but we have to do a much better job on the interdiction side, which means we have to work with our international community on tracking the pill mill, pieces, the precursors to the pills, and the chemicals. We can do all that. We can find a lot of algorithmic processes to screen out a lot of the drug trade to our country. So all I'm saying is, I guarantee no one on the State Department committee gets that briefing. Guarantee they don't get that.
So I got to go to a speed round. I got 2 questions, and then I'm going to throw it open to the audience here, okay? So please, you've got open forum, and all you need is 1 question. We'll get through the rest of the day, The first question, 2 or 3 things that businesses in the room today can do to be engaged in this advocacy, or to save money in their business.
Honestly, as I said, Governor Leavitt works as an advisor of the Business Roundtable. We've got a specific strategy to try to present an action plan for the Business Roundtable on these issues, because these issues impinge on our economy. This is our economy, stupid, right? We have the workforce challenges we have in this country. If we don't wrap our arms around them, especially the up-and-coming challenges of young people, we are in a real strait. As we already know, every business knows, with kind of back to work and virtual and everything else. So we need a strategy, and I'm not going to think that I can do it alone. And you've got, Governor Leavitt's enormously capable, has a really terrific staff, and so we're working together on that. So all I'm saying is there's groups out there who are coming up with templates on what your employee assistance program should look like, what your third-party administrator needs to be doing, how to spot check whether there is sufficient in-network capacity within your benefit plan. So if any of your employees need to get help, they're not like put on hold forever, and they of course get immediate care, especially if it comes for their kids too, because if your children aren't getting timely access to care, that's going to take the parent offline, which is going to create big productivity issues for businesses. So these are all financial issues ultimately, and that's why with your help at KPMG, we love the partnership that you're bringing to this, because we're working with you and McKinsey to do the deep dive on access by zip code using the data KPMG is, and we're partnering with McKinsey on systems analysis in the space. My feeling is if I can get a scorecard for every member of Congress to show them what, pardon my French, shitty mental health they have in their district, and then I give them the answers to the test. Here are the big votes you've got to make in order to improve the mental health and well-being of your constituents. This becomes a bipartisan issue because red state America is suffering terribly. They've got much worse access to care. And if we can make it an issue of justice, where they're saying, why are all those blue states getting all the access to care and we're getting, screwed over? Like my just elementary political thinking is that we can really start to make this the bipartisan, and not about SAMHSA. I love SAMHSA, but they're a grant-making organization. We don't fight cancer with grants. We don't have a grant-making cancer. We pay for cancer reimbursement through our CMS reimbursement policies. In mental health, we are consistently the lowest reimbursements of both product, services, and everything, inpatient, hospital, everything. So unless we fundamentally change the funding systems, we're going to be stuck with all of our emergency rooms bursting with people stuck in our ERs, what's called boarding. And if you look at it as a parity issue, we don't make people wait, on average, 12 hours longer for care, which is what they end up doing to get mental health care in an ER than they would get care for anything else, because ERs don't know what to do, and they just hold them and they can't send them anywhere. So all of that's a result of a lack of investment.
Last question from me, and this is one that's traditional. David usually asks our guests, have you ever thought of running for president?
Well, I got out of Congress to save my own mental health, and that would not be very good for my sobriety, I can tell you that. But I do feel like I would very much like to be part of the policy making on this for a president. So I routinely go to visit with the Domestic Policy Council and Office of National Drug Control Policy and the Hill, and I really honestly feel like I know what needs to be done, because I've talked to everybody. I know where all the gaps in the services are, and I'd love to be able to hone a president's agenda on this, because the problem is this is just a series of one-offs. We don't have a strategic goal that includes the whole administration's efforts in this. And unless it's comprehensive, we're never going to get to the bottom line of improving total outcomes.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for doing that. Questions from the audience? I think we have a microphone.
I'll speak up here. Mike Kiley from UPS. As a father of 3 teenage boys, who, as much as we don't want him to, spends a lot of time on social media, what role do you think that plays to really heighten what's going on in mental health? And can we turn that around and use that conduit to actually improve the mental health of our young people? Because they just have so much social pressure these days that I just find it so difficult for them to just make a mistake.
Yeah. Yeah, no, totally. Well, I mean, I think we have an FDA because we don't want side effects of bad drugs, right? This has been a bomb on our psyche as a people and a society, and yet we've never taken full stock in the implications of the access of technology like we have. And its impact on kids is obviously much better understood today. all I know is I'm just really intentional with my kids. I don't put, as hard as it is, I really am putting my phone away when I'm around them, so I'm paying attention to them. I'm doing everything I can to take them outside to play sports. I'm like really limiting their access to technology. But I would say this, we need a totally new public health approach to children's mental health, because we're setting our kids up for disaster. Honestly, I hate to be over dramatic about this, but they're having to walk through a gauntlet. So they got social media left and right. They've got like online pornography that blow the back of your head off. Like I used to think like seeing a Penthouse or a Playboy. This stuff is, out there. You got gaming. Every time you look at this major sports thing, they're advertising sportsbook and Kings and everything else, and then we're commercializing marijuana, which has become an article of faith amongst my fellow Democrats that they should be for this thing. When we used to be against big tobacco, that was where my dad was and Henry Waxman and all the rest. I mean, and we're legalizing, psilocybin in states just by fiat. All I'm saying is like, how do kids make it through? Like in my town, I went and testified against a sighting of a pot shop in my area. And my small little community, I don't want my kids going over playing at their friend's house and having little gummy bears and, THC-infused brownies and elixirs. I'm not being dramatic about this. There's going to be a major, major crisis because we're already having a record homeless population. Psychosis is incredible now with the high rate of potency. We can't even treat people today with schizophrenia. And we know this is an addiction crisis. We just learned about it through Purdue Pharma. What happens when you spoil these companies with too much money? It corrupts. And we all know from our time on the Hill, the power of the liquor industry. We've not placed one single additional excise tax on liquor since the first days of legalization. My point is, do you really think the public health is gonna win out in this new move for mass commercialization of a new, and by the way, marijuana is addictive. I know, I'm in recovery. Wasn't the top list of things I was addicted to, but a lot of my friends who are in recovery today, big problem. So, and they got the gambling problem, and they got the eating problem, they got the sex problem. All I'm saying is our kids' brains today are wired for addiction. Wired for, like my dad used to make me go make the fire in the wintertime, and he said, Patrick, go get that kindling to start the fire. Right now, the kindling is all over with our young people in terms of the wiring of their brains for quick dopamine response, thanks to that technology. And we all know it as adults. We all see that we want relief, or well, what's the latest news feed? And you're saying afterward, why did I just lose that last half an hour going down that rabbit hole? And these kids have no way of stopping that. So all I'm saying is we just need much better hygiene. We talked about we're not physically fit, but we're certainly not mentally fit. And as a nation, we should really put an emphasis on both for the betterment. The military can't recruit people now. They're all you used to be knocked out of the box if you had ever tested positive. They're all testing positive for THC coming into the military. So, and by the way, for all of you as employers, I mean, guess what? Big issue, because if you have any requirement that your employees be drug-free, that's going to be a major HR company liability like you can't even believe. So I'm for decriminalization. I'm not for people going to jail for this stuff, but this thing of we're now going to pass banking for marijuana. Anyway, my point is that it's not just this, it's a writ large problem. And I live on the shore in Atlantic City, so we have every addiction catered to us in every different way. And took my kid to the Phillies baseball game. Sorry, Red Sox fans, but I live in South Jersey, so it's Phillies. They were saying, hot dog here, hot dog. get your beer and vodka spritzer, get your beer and vodka spritzer. I said, what, vodka? Yeah, all of the Little League moms and dads had vodka spritzers they were holding, not Bud Lights. So, I don't know, now I sound like, one of those old people that I grew up thinking that didn't get it, right?
I think we had a question right behind you, Michael. Did you? Oh, there's one here. Oh, great. Oh, sorry. Great.
Hello, Congressman Sam Feist. I'm with CNN, but I'm not a reporter. First of all, you have, over the last hour, talked about mental health in a language of Washington that I have never heard before, and I think it was great and refreshing because we in this room speak a foreign language to most Americans, and you talked about it on a level that I think we can understand. I have two questions. The first one's easy, yes or no. I'm going to follow up to Tim's question. You didn't answer the question about running for president, but are you going to run for elective office ever again? Just curious, because you still seem to be pretty good at this. And then my real question is, just give a little bit on how you have stayed in recovery. You've been, I think, 10 years now.
12.
12 years. What's your story?
Get it right. Come on. No, I love it when because I go to these mental health events and I go, and I'm a person in long-term recovery, which means I haven't had to drink or drug since February 22nd, 2011, and I get a big applause. And I said, can't believe I get applauded for being stone cold, sober person, but that's the way it is today. Everyone thinks it's a big deal. It is a big deal if you have the disease of addiction, because I was first in rehab at 17. I didn't get sober till 42. And along the way, multiple rehabs. I now have Horizon Blue Cross in New Jersey is my platinum insurer for me and my kids. And I haven't had to go to the ER once in 12 years. And I'm just saying, like they ought to be cutting a huge check to my 12-step group because I'm not in active addiction. I mean, I used to go, up then we had, thankfully, Bethesda Naval Hospital and the, attending physician's office. I was also going to ERs all the time in Rhode Island and back here for contusions, for lacerations, for irritable bowel, for back pain. All of that miraculously went away when I got sober. I don't know how that happened, but when you write up these conditions in hospitals, you're never underwriting the original cause of these things. You're just sewing them up. Countless stitches over the years, countless contusions. So, my point is that for me, I go to meetings every day or talk to my sponsor or someone in recovery every day. I love meetings. It's like, as much as I know, and I've been to a million meetings, every meeting I'm like, oh my God, that's so cool. Like, that's so interesting, because people are talking about like hair-raising scenarios where they're trying to survive and not drink and drug. And I'm like totally humbled by it. Like, whatever my problems are in the world, I totally get their privileged problems. Anyway, I'll just share this because I just heard in a meeting yesterday. Guy said, money will solve 80% of my problems. Money and a good lawyer will solve 90% of my problems. But humility and acceptance will solve 100% of my problems. And for people like me who spent my whole life trying to get everything the way I want it, so I get the vote, I get the bill passed, I get this one to like me, I get this good story, it's exhausting when you can let go of having to micromanage everything in the world and being the director of the show. The release you get in life is what keeps me sober, because I'm not having to, I try to be intentional about not overextending myself, even though that's my inclination. So it's on my bucket list to run for governor in Rhode Island someday, because I have 5 kids, and I think between all the higher institutions of higher learning in Rhode Island, one of them's going to end up going to school there. And that will be my ticket to go back. So.
Do we have one more? And pink, yes.
I I'm Julie Chase, and Patrick, I've known you for years,
Yes.
and I still have my legislation that you signed over and a copy of it, so I'm very proud of how far you've come.
Thank you.
It's been a long way. Curious though, with everything that you do cover under mental illness, does it also fall into sports for children and adults and the pressure they have, and then even going into concussions?
Sure. So I thought after the Iraq-Afghan war, with the, quote, invisible wounds of war, I thought for sure, because I'm a Pol, I want to look for that thing, that train that I can attach this movement to. And I thought the suicide rate of our veterans, 23, 24 a day, and the, quote, invisible wounds of war, were going to galvanize, much like the Cold War galvanized, Dwight Eisenhower to create the national highway system, which was all built because of national security. Like, I thought we were going to do massive neuroscience after the Iraq-Afghan war because of all of our veterans who had gotten traumatic brain injuries, and which, by the way, we know lead to, if they live to 70, would lead to cognitive decline and often dementia. But they were taking their lives in their 20s and 30s, like many football players do, because concussions actually create an impulse control problem. Okay, so when you have that depression and anxiety, your ability to mediate it and stop it becomes limited when you've had concussions. It's just one of the many impacts of concussions. So for people with TBI, it's mental. The effects are depression and anxiety. People just think about the neurological impacts of concussion. There's affective disorder impacts. So my point is I thought we could rally Republicans and Democrats around saving our soldiers, because this was going to clearly be part of war now, was these TBIs, and could we do a better job immediately reducing swelling in the brain, for example. But it never happened. It never happened. We hired General Pete Corelli, 4-star, ran operations in Iraq as our head of One Mind. And of course, I call this One Mind with my friend Garen Staglin, because we had to be of one mind on brain research. We tried to get all of the both affective disorders and neurological disorders, meaning the Autism Speaks and Alzheimer's Foundation, along with Addiction Speaks and DBSA, Depression Bipolar Society. Because if you look at traumatic brain injury, it co-occurs with trauma. And the sequela of that for these veterans would give us an understanding of both addiction, depression, anxiety, and neurological disorders like ALS, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's, which are what we understand to be the impact of TBI, but we don't understand the other piece. So my whole point was I thought we could justify with the Congress huge infusion of dollars into neuroscience. Part of our job on an agenda is to include neuroscience in our agenda. It's not included. You can go to all of the big mental health advocacy groups, look at their list of agenda items. Neuroscience is not sexy, but I can tell you, we have a golden opportunity collaborating with Europe, with Australia, even China, on massive data sets on replicable science in neuroscience that could give us breakthrough therapies to help everything from depression to schizophrenia to bipolar. Really, it can happen. But with the computing power that we have today. In any event, that's a long way of saying, like, yes, kids' exposure is enormous. My son plays flag football. That's all I'm letting him do. But he's very good at it, by the way. He's very good. I said, stay in the pool. Don't you want to become a swimmer?
Patrick, Mary said that people would love us if we gave them 5 to 10 minutes back in their day. So I think we'll. You want more? Okay. Well, actually, he'll be here afterwards, so that's the perfect time for you to come up and ask any more questions. So we will give the rest of you your time back. But Patrick, we want to thank you for coming.